All right, so Revelation 14, and we're going to look at verses 14 to 20 this morning. So Revelation 14, verses 14 through 20. So we arrived this morning at the end of the unusual 14th chapter of Revelation. I say unusual because I think the 14th chapter would be better served by being broken up into 3 different chapters instead of being held together by one. And I think this section of Revelation 14 is probably the toughest of all of them to place in context and also to know what is precisely going on. So just to back up to remind everybody where we are in this chapter, the first 2 sections are really meant to serve as a breath of fresh air. This is hope for the suffering Christian, both those who suffer throughout church history and especially for those who will suffer in the final days. So we saw the wonderful hope of the vision of the 144,000 on Zion, and then we followed that with these angelic announcements that promise blessing for those who believe in the gospel, as well as punishment for those who take on the mark of the beast. And after those announcements, we take a turn to a new vision, a vision that you could legitimately say is the vision of judgment, and you could call this the judgment of the earth. I believe this passage is meant in the context of Revelation to serve as a bridge from what's come before to the start of the bowl judgments. So the bowl judgments are really in the most profound and deep and impactful way the wrath of God, the wrath of the Son of Man being poured out on the earth. And so right before we cover that, we are introduced to the Son of Man. And then following that introduction to the Son of Man, then we have those bowl judgments. And so I think the purpose of this section is to prepare the reader to understand that all the coming judgments are from the Son of Man. So what we're introduced in these verses to is the wrath of the Son of Man that will come later in chapters 15 and 16. But the interesting way that John goes about showing us that the bowl judgments will come through the Son of Man is by starting with the conclusion of the bowl judgments. So he gives us this little preview of what's going to happen at the very end of the bowl judgments as a literary device to let us know that everything we're going to see in the 2 chapters to follow are going to all be from the Son of Man. Now, I'm going to cover this passage a little bit different than the ones that come before because there's some interpretive issues going on here. And in order to do that, what we're going to start off by doing is reading through the entire passage as a whole, Revelation 14, verses 14 through 20. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, and having a gold crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he cried with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Put in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. So in a nutshell, what we see in these verses is an image of the Son of Man with a sickle and then his reaping that is done with that sickle. Now, there's 2 primary ways that those who take a prophetic or futuristic view of Revelation take these verses. One view is what I'm going to call the pre-wrath view. The pre-wrath view also fits with the post-tribulational rapture view and the mid-tribulational rapture view, and they connect those to the bowl judgments in various ways. But those who hold to those different rapture views, mid-tribulation, pre-wrath, post-tribulation view, all of those individuals, at least the majority of them, will hold Revelation 14 to 16 as the rapture of the church. So their belief is that Jesus raptures the church before the bowl judgments or before the final wrath that is poured out at Christ's return. So verses 14 through 16 from their perspective is the rapture of the church in the midst of the tribulation period. And then starting in verse 17, we have a second harvest, and that harvest is the harvest of judgment that occurs at Christ's return. Now, I want to start by saying, even though I don't hold to this view, I am somewhat sympathetic to it because I can understand how you can read these verses and come to that conclusion. It's understandable that you could read these verses and view them as two harvests or two reapings, the first bringing about the security of the church and the second bringing about the judgment for the world. I don't believe someone needs to be theologically controlled or manipulated by their system in order to hold that view. As an instance of a type of interpretation where someone's just clearly being manipulated by their system, there are those in the church who believe a view which is called exhaustive divine determinism. Exhaustive divine determinism means that God minutely controls and decrees everything that occurs in history. So everything that happens according to the decree of God. The famous proponents of this are the later writings of Augustine, and then you have John Calvin, R.C. Sproul, John Piper. They all taught that. But in order to have that view in Scripture, it requires you to take probably about 1,000 passages and really turn them right on their head. So for example, right in the Garden of Eden, you have God telling Adam and Eve, I don't want you to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Like God decreed it. He said, don't do it. Gave them consequences for not doing it. But if you believe in the exhaustive divine determinism, you have to believe that even though God said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, secretly, God really wanted them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Therefore, when they did, they were doing it according to the will of God. So the fall was God's plan because he decreed it all along. So you need to flip the Bible on its head really to come to those conclusions. But here in Revelation 14 through 16, to see this as the rapture, while I don't agree with it, I also do think it is a legitimate option that you could bring forth from the text. I understand why people believe it. I think you could even view this as two different harvests, even if you have a pre-trib rapture view, under the understanding that we have some passages in the Minor Prophets, also in Revelation, where we see that at the coming of Jesus Christ, what will Jesus do for the believers on earth at the time of his coming? He will shelter them and bring them into a place of refuge. So this could even be speaking of a first gathering by Christ where he brings those living on earth into that place of shelter in the Mount of Olives. We know based on Zechariah and Revelation when that occurs. I don't think that's either the best option. But one thing I do want to make clear is that there are a lot of people sort of in our future view of Revelation camp who's going to look at this passage and say, we got two different reapings, one for security, one for judgment. And I think it's a possibility. I don't agree with it, but I think it's a legitimate option for the text. I think the best way to look at this is to see this as one reaping, but you have it slightly from two different focus. You see something similar happen in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 with the creation. This is a common Hebrew thing to have one event and sort of look at it back to back from two slightly different perspectives. We have sort of a miniature of our passage this morning in Joel chapter 3, verse 13. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. So Joel is not saying there's a harvest, that's one event, and then a treading of a winepress, that's a second event. So you have two different things of bringing it together. But Joel's just picturing one single harvesting or bringing in judgment together. And I think that Revelation 14 through 20 is doing the same thing. It's telling us of one judgment from the Lord. Just initially, there's a focus on the harvest. And then second, there is a focus on the treading of the winepress, which is what we see here. So let's walk through this image of the judgment at the second coming and see how it sets the stage for the bowl judgments of the tribulation. So let's begin with the image of the one who is bringing the judgment in verse 14. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on that cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. This is none other than an image of Jesus Christ coming to earth. Now, there are some people who picture this as an angel, and the reason for that is in verse 15, an angel will come and tell the Son of Man, okay, it is time for you to harvest the earth. And so people are like, well, we're not going to have an angel commanding the Son of Man and telling him what to do, so this must not be Jesus. But I don't think there's a problem with it at all for an angel coming to Jesus and saying, this is the time for the harvest, because we see something very similar earlier in Scripture. If you remember in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens before God rains down the fire from heaven? He sends angels into Sodom to go and determine, to make sure, is it really the time of judgment? And although we don't see it in Genesis, the understanding point of the passage is those angels see what's going on, they get Lot and his family out, and then they go and tell God, yeah, God, it's time for the judgment. And we see something very similar happening here. This doesn't mean that angel has authority over the Son of Man, but this is just, again, God showing perfectly clear that this is just not a whim of wrath that he is bringing upon the earth, but he is making sure that this is just the right timing has come for the wrath to fall. And the imagery here of the Son of Man also aligns pretty staggering in line with the picture of the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. And that Son of Man is the one who is given a kingdom over all nations that will not pass away. So that is one of the ultimate messianic passages. And then on top of that, what was Jesus's own favorite term to define and talk about himself? He called himself the Son of Man again and again and again. And this is John writing about the Son of Man. And you'd have to believe that from John's perspective, who lived with Jesus for those 3 years, when John hears Son of Man, he's thinking Jesus. So this is none other than Jesus coming to rule and bringing victory. And I believe the sharp sickle pictures his judgment on the earth. And we have the picture of him bringing that judgment in verses 15 and 16. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe." Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. So I have a few important notes that we want to make here as far as what happens at Jesus' second coming. The first thing that we want to note is, and we just highlighted and hinted on this before, is the first thing that's highlighted is the timing. It says the hour to reap has come because the harvest of the earth is ripe. And so this phrase indicates that the judgment of the Son of Man will be just. He is not executing those who are innocent while sitting on death row. He's not flying off the handle in wrath because a few kids forgot to clean up their rooms. But the time for the wrath and the judgment has come because the earth is ripe for it. It's even repeated in both 15 and 16 to solidify this reality. There is no doubt that this is the time for God's judgment. But this not only points to God's justice, but it also points to God's patience as well. That the Lord has allowed the evils of this world to run its full course. The fact that the earth makes it to this ripe stage of judgment pictures the fact that God was patient and God was compassionate to allow it to make it all the way to that point of depravity. So often we look at the world and we see things that are like, oh my word, I can't believe that scene is good today because like 5 minutes ago, everybody knew that was evil. And we think this is so terrible. How is Jesus not coming back right now? Well, whenever we get frustrated about the evils in our generation today, it's actually a sign of God's patience. It's a sign of his compassion because it means that God is slow to anger. And he gives them day after day, year after year, generation after generation to turn to Christ and repent. God continues to send his witnesses that they might believe. I mean, one of the major emphases of Revelation is that God continues to send witnesses to the very end. God continues to be patient. So when we see that the earth is ripe for judgment, that shows us that God has been patient and gracious as he waits upon earth to come to that place of being ripe for judgment. The second thing we want to note about this judgment is that Jesus is personally involved in the final judgment. Angels are not serving as his proxy as he watches from heaven above, but he is coming to earth and he is handling this judgment himself. He is the one who is swinging the first sickle. I recently watched the movie Clash of the Titans with my boys, and it's the movie about the Iliad and how they not the Iliad, but it takes the Greek gods and a bunch of their stories and turns it into an action movie. But Isaac really wanted to watch it because he just wanted to see that one scene where Liam Neeson's character says, "Unleash the Kraken," and so we watched it just so we could see that one moment. But one of the things that's interesting about Greek mythology and really all the mythology of that day, and you see it in this movie, is that the gods, Zeus, Hera, Hades, they are involved in earth, but it's always in this very kind of aloof, indirect manner. All they want is the worship from the petty people on earth, but they don't really want to get their hands involved in anything. You even see that in the scene of sending the Kraken. Zeus is not going to come to earth himself to judge mankind, but he's going to have this great monster come up from the sea in order to do it. And while we don't normally look at these emphases as contrast between polytheism and Christianity, but I think this would have been a very important note in John's own day, that I think John is trying to make the point that Jesus Christ is a personal God. God, the Creator, is a God who is involved with his creation. Our God is not the kind of God who the only time he's going to come down to earth is when he's in a drunk stupor and maybe sleep with a beautiful woman and leave a demigod or send a raging storm. But our Son of Man, our God, is one who has a personal involvement in the earth that he has made. And again, that probably doesn't resonate too much to us because we grow up in church and we've heard about God's personal involvement all the time. But if you came from a polytheistic world, and you hear about God sending his son to earth, you hear about the Son of God having direct involvement in this judgment, I think it hits a lot different from the cultural background that they came from of polytheism to see the way that God is involved in his planet. So I think it's probably a highlight of this passage in the fact that Jesus himself is the one who swings that sickle, because it really shows a contrast in Jesus's character and his involvement in the world compared to what the people of John's generation would have saw from their pagan gods. And so Jesus comes, he delivers his judgment personally on earth, and then what we get in verses 17 through 20 is just a restatement of that same judgment from a little bit different perspective and a little more details, some of which we might not enjoy so much reading about. So verses 17 through 20 say, "And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar. And he called out with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vines of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of 200 miles." So verses 14 through 16 show the sickle of the Son of Man going forth in judgment. And now the focus of verses 17 through 20 is on the treading of the winepress, with more of a focus on the involvement of the angels in the midst of the great wrath that Jesus brings on earth. Now, again, as we've seen before with the other angels in chapter 14, the use of saying another angel is a way simply to say this angel is not an angel that we've seen earlier in the book of Revelation. We're being introduced to yet another one. So we get a lot that we get introduced to in Revelation. I wish we would know all of their names, but we don't. But we get a lot of different angels in this story. One has a sharp sickle. One has a loud voice. My opinion is that these two angels are meant to represent a host of angels that will be with Christ when he comes to reap his judgment on earth. So what we're seeing here is that not only will Jesus personally bring that judgment upon earth, but it will also involve angelic forces who are with him in the midst of that conflict. So Jesus will lead the judgment, but he will be served by his angels. Now, maybe this is saying that Jesus' involvement will be more like a general directing his troops, that Jesus will bring the judgment and the angels will execute it. But based on the image that we see of Jesus in the Gospels, I think Jesus strikes that very healthy balance of the leader who both gets his hands dirty and then also leads others to be involved and get their hands dirty as well. I mean, one of the great things about the Gospels is all the various ways that Jesus gets his hands dirty. Jesus touches lepers. Jesus spits and rubs mud into a guy's eye. And then at the same time, he still delegates the disciples to minister as well. And probably the best contrast of seeing all this together is with the feeding of the 5,000 that we just went through a couple of weeks ago, because Jesus is the one dividing the bread. Jesus is the one dividing up the fish, but the disciples are the one making the distribution to all the people. And I see this as how it will work in the second coming of Jesus. Jesus is going to swing the sickle. He'll be in the lead with his troops, but he will do so with a coordinated effort with all of his messengers, who are the angels. And let's also note the central location of this battle. We read that the winepress was trodden outside the city. Now, the passage doesn't tell us what the city is, but to be frank, there's only one option for what this city could be, and that is it's got to be Jerusalem. The minor prophets make it abundantly clear that when the shepherd of the Lord, when the Son of Man, when the Messiah comes to earth, he will come to the city of Jerusalem. That is where he will make his return. That is where he will have his conquest. So it's clear that this battle that will take place between angels and Jesus versus the armies of men will take place outside of Jerusalem. And I think this is one place where it's so obvious that John didn't need to write it down for his audience, because everybody who's read the prophets should know that this is Jerusalem. And then that brings us to the difficult part of this judgment, which is the way the aftermath is described. So we read, and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came up out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of 200 miles. So I'm going to say all of these images are nauseating. First, the winepress image is terrible. It's the image of the Son of Man and his angels basically stepping upon and crushing their foes. The enemies are the grapes, and the Son of Man and his angels are the feet. I don't think this is primarily, though, meant to be a grotesque image that like Jesus is going to come down as a giant and actually crush his enemies under his feet. But I think the purpose of this is to show the superiority of the heavenly forces and the inevitability of their victory. I think the image that we should have of this is that the possibility of the armies of man overcoming the Son of Man and his angels would be equally as possible as if a farmer went and took a bushel of grapes, dumped them into the wine press, and then those grapes somehow were to climb up and crush the farmer who was about to crush them. Like, if a farmer is throwing grapes into the wine press, those grapes are not going to win. The grapes are not going to overcome the farmer. The farmer will crush those grapes. So what it's meant to picture is an overwhelming and inevitable victory by the Son of Man on account of the wrath of God. But then we come to probably the real nauseating and also one of the more confusing parts of Revelation. I think there's symbolic exaggeration in here. If you want to take it literally, that's fine, So what we read here is that the result of this conquest is that there will be a river of blood that is the depth of a horse's bridle, and it will flow from one end to another for 200 miles. The Greek is 1,600 stadia, which equals out just under 200 miles probably. You could probably round up to get at that point. Now, the average horse's bridle sits 15 hands from the ground. And a hand equals to 4 inches. 15 hands is 5 feet in height. So we're talking about a river 5 feet in height, an unknown width, and a length of 200 miles long. The interesting thing is how long is 200 miles when you line it up in the land of Israel and you located it around Jerusalem. One of those nice things about Google Maps makes it really easy for us to know how long 200 miles is. But 200 miles takes us from one end of Israel to the other. It takes us basically from the southernmost part of Israel up to the northernmost part of the promised land. Now, this makes me think that the depth and the length of the blood is not meant to picture a literal river, but it's meant to picture the totality and the utter annihilation of the enemies of the Lord. To be honest, if this river was like 90 miles, and that would mean that it would stretch from like Jerusalem to the Sea of Galilee or from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, I could totally be like, I think that seems like realistic. But when you take the 200 miles and that stretches out the length from the north to the south of the promised land, I think that this is probably a better picture. That what John is communicating here is not that we're going to have this river of blood flowing from Jerusalem, but the picture is that all of the enemies of the Messiah, not just around the borders of Jerusalem, but all of them from the farthest southern point to the highest northern point, all of them will be cleared out of the promised land. So I think the picture is not of the depth of a river flowing through the nation, but I think it's picturing a thorough conquest of all of God's enemies who are in the promised land. That this victory won't just simply be located outside the walls of Jerusalem, but this victory will be located throughout the entire country of the promised land. Now, if you want to go onto the side of literalism and say, I think there's going to be a river of blood. Like, I think there's going to be that many enemies surrounding Jerusalem. Like, I think there's going to be millions of foes. And when they all die, it's going to be such a bloody fest that there's actually going to be a river. And it's really going to be 5 feet deep. And if you're going to go with that historical view, then I'm not going to put a big, disagreement on that. I think if you're going to err on the side of symbolism or literalism, it's always safer to err on the side of literalism and what's going to happen. But I think that we can sometimes err too much on the side of literalism. An example of Christians who err too much on the side of taking literal interpretations are those Christians who look at people who are dead in sin, and they say that being dead in sin means that you're unable to believe in the gospel. Because dead people can't do anything. And since dead people can't do anything, people who are dead in sin can't believe in the gospel. And, you're stretching that image too literal, too far. That's not what it's meant to contain. So I think that seeing this as a river might be stretching the literalism too far, but I don't want to get into a big argument with anybody who would want to see it as a real river, because one of the arguments for seeing it as a real river is that there's none of those like as words that John has in here. So it could possibly be that. But I think the picture of it is to say we're having a total victory from the south to the north in the promised land, and the Son of Man will overcome it all. So the key for this section, though, is to see that when the Son of Man comes, it will be a complete, thorough, and overwhelming victory. The river from the south to the north is not meant to show us that the victory of Jesus will not be a limited victory just around the walls of Jerusalem, but it will be a victory that will cover the farthest points in the promised land. So the Son of Man will end the Great Tribulation, and he will begin the millennial kingdom first and foremost by cleansing the promised land, by making clear the way for his rule and reign. And let's be honest, it will not be pretty. It will not be a story that's fit for bedtime for kids. But the result of it will be peace and joy on earth following the judgment. But that peace does not come without the judgment first. And one of the sort of interesting historical notes of people who look back at a time of judgment and actually think of a good thing is if you look at the people of Japan. The most horrific thing happened to the people of Japan at the end of World War II. The end of World War II, the way that we bombed them was awful. And the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the nuclear bombs, they were just like the exclamation point on the end of a horrific series of bombings. And the initial bombing runs were all led by one general during World War II, and that general was known as Charles LeMay. And he bombed so many people in Europe and in Asia that he became known as Bombs Away LeMay. And so he killed, probably based on his command, you could probably say Charles LeMay killed more people than anyone else in human history. Just his bombing runs just entirely decimated cities, firebombing out Japan. But the reason he did it was that there was no way Japan was going to end this war. They were going to continue and drag it out forever and ever and ever until they basically starved to death the entire country of Japan. And so part of the impetus for these bombing runs were, we need to so humiliate and obliterate the Japanese forces that they'll surrender so that we can save all of these people who are going to starve to death if this war continues. And so that was the reason for these bombings. And the estimates are that if the war would have continued without them, millions upon millions of Japanese would have died in more than what died in the bombing, to the point where Charles LeMay, who led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Japanese, was actually awarded a Medal of Honor by the Japanese. When the war was over, the Japanese awarded LeMay a Medal of Honor for saying, "Thank you for ending this war." Like, the citizens of Japan wanted the war over. They didn't want it to keep going on. And so they thanked and awarded LeMay for that judgment, because the judgment then brought the peace, and they wanted the peace. And I think the same type of picture is happening here. Jesus is not bringing this judgment simply because he's this wrathful, awful people, but he's bringing this judgment because he wants the peace to follow. So what we see here, what we're going to see in the bowl judgments to follow, they all have an end goal. And that end goal is the dominion and the victory of Jesus Christ, so we can bring out that millennial kingdom of peace. But in order to bring out that kingdom of peace, the first thing he needs to do is clear out the enemies who will oppose the establishment of his kingdom. And we see him doing this in two ways. First, we see the finality of it in his second coming. And then second, we're going to see the bowl judgments that sort of get everything prepared and moved into the direction for that final judgment.